The €11 billion figure can by default sound like a success. This budget is a failure to invest in state services. The headline tax cuts may look good, but in reality, they're very poor value for people. At nearly 11 billion, this budget could have been a change one. This budget should have been about investing in our public services. Public services are getting by on threadbare budgets, while the government's tax cut will disproportionately benefit the better off. The 1.1 billion income tax package should be used for social and healthcare, education, public transport, community facilities and climate action. What about the thousands of people waiting on lists for community disability network teams? What about multi-annual funding for mental health beds in Bantry Hospital and beyond? What about the wastewater treatment plants that need investment across the country? Any benefit for households will quickly be eaten up by some of the highest childcare costs in Europe, rising rents, so-called voluntary school contributions, GP home visits, home care, and so much more. These tax cuts will end up costing average families more. If that 1.1 billion was invested in services, it would have a significantly larger positive impact due to economy of scales. The same amount of money given in little amounts to many people is much less efficient. It is an irresponsible fiscal policy. It is obviously ideologically driven, and that is the main difference between a social democratic approach and the centre-right approach of the government parties. But it's painful to watch you attempt to make this seem like a progressive budget. At least own your own policies. These long-term decisions will benefit the better off, that is clear, while the more vulnerable, those on disability allowance, carers, pensioners, only get temporary measures, one-off payments. In the middle of a housing disaster, with record numbers of homeless people and failed government policy, the least we could expect is a new approach. But no, instead we get more half measures that benefit developers and investments funds more than people who need a home. Young people and families are being priced out of the rental market, and home ownership is simply impossible for so many. And then yesterday's budget offers no hope, and will probably be the final straw for so many young people who are considering immigrating. The government has made a big deal about its renter tax credit, but everyone knows that in reality it will be quickly gobbled up through rent increases, not to mind those on fixed incomes who won't be able to avail of it. Without a rent freeze, what's the point? We need a rent freeze, and we need it now. Today when I looked, I found only 10 places to rent in my entire constituency and fewer than 100 homes under 300,000. And then at the same time, there are hundreds of vacant and deteriorating houses in towns and villages across the countryside. And then meanwhile, incredibly, the budget has introduced a 0.3% tax on vacant homes. This is a blatantly empty gesture when house prices inflation is running at about 8%. 0.3% will be utterly useless in tackling vacancy and dereliction, and we all know that. It feels like you somehow don't realise that we're years into a desperate housing emergency. Where's the urgency? We drastically need policy with teeth to stop speculation and at the same time support to help turn vacant and derelict buildings in urban and rural areas into homes. This is more economically and environmentally efficient. It is just beyond belief that the government is not doing this on the scale that is required. This Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael government, like the Fine Gael government before it, is failing to address the housing disaster, and the situation is getting worse under continued failed policies. Budget 2023 can be added to this list. Again, it's ordinary families and young people who will pay the price for your failures. On disability, in July, the government passed the Social Democrats' motion calling for an increase in the disability allowance by at least €15 per week and a cost of disability payment of €20 per week. Instead, the government is only giving a €12 increase for core welfare and a €500 one-off payment when obviously disability is a long-term or permanent issue for people. It is not only highly cynical but deeply disrespectful to give disabled people and their families the impression you're going to recognise their struggles and then actually give them almost €700 less this year. Instead of the 1,040 more every year, only a once-off of €500. Temporary payments do not address systemic issues of poverty, exclusion and disempowerment for people with disabilities. Your own reports have highlighted that it can cost up to €12,300 more annually to live with a disability in Ireland. While I welcome the additional funding of disability services, it still falls short of the amount outlined in the Department of Health's own Disability Capacity Review to 2032. Although funding is essential, it also needs to be supported by plans for its implementations. The Children's Disability Network teams are chronically understaffed and there are major issues with retention and recruitment. These issues must be addressed if the budget is going to make a real impact for those children and their families. Rural Ireland has been left deeply worried about climate action due to the rhetoric put forward by the big players. This budget is a missed opportunity to invest in and outline a just transition for small farmers and rural residents. Instead, we have the repackaging of the same agricultural schemes and retrofitting announcements when targets continue to be missed. The lack of public transport remains one of the largest social and environmental issues in rural Ireland. There are vulnerable groups and whole communities screaming out for local link services, but the fund just is not there. Climate action should have been at the forefront and the centre of this budget. Instead, it's only an afterthought. The underinvestment in public services will cost families, as will the lack of ambition in climate action. Long after the once-off measures are spent, the larger systemic issues will remain and everyone will end up paying for your mistakes.
Thank you, Deputy.